Today, more people recognize McDonald's golden arches than the Christian cross. Eight of the world's top companies are from the US, and there are only two countries in the world where Coca Cola cannot be sold, that being Cuba and North Korea. These are just some of the many examples that demonstrate the USA's dominance over the rest of the world. The USA's dominance is not only projected through corporations, most of it is actually through military and political ties. The US is the nation with the most foreign bases. The majority of nations in Europe and the Americas have a US military presence. The US has such a large foreign presence that many European nations have small/severely underfunded militaries because of the large US presence there. Many nations across the world solely depend on US aid/trade ties. The Baltic nations are small and weak, and near an expansionist Russia. Their sovereignty isn't always assured, yet the US protects these nations and makes sure Russia does not invade them. Israel is even in a worse position because they are surrounded by a lot of enemies, from Syria to Lebanon. The United States of America is willing to help them and protect them. South Korea is on the border with a nuclear armed, backwards, crazy, Orwellian dictatorship that is hell bent on destroying it. Yet the United States protects it. The United States very clearly has set up a hegemonic domain over many other nations, and it has made itself useful in the policies and sovereignty of other nations. But why? Why does the US have so much control over the rest of the world? Important to remember that for its first century and a half, the United States was not an interventionist power. Their first major war was against Spain, and even that was mostly in America's doorstep in Cuba and Puerto Rico. The United States hardly ever fought a war. This doctrine was set up by President James Monroe, who secured the independence of Latin American nations from would-be European colonizers. This did wonders for America, keeping it away from old world politics. Yet the United States would intervene quite a bit in the politics of Latin America, invading Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and countless other Central American nations dozens of times. This was very important for the United States because it meant a lot of imports from tropical nations. This would lead to the establishment of the banana republics. Yet things would change in January of 1917 when the Britain would intercept a German telegraph, which was coded and seemed to imply that Germany was looking for war with America in the midst of the First World War. The United States would not do anything major in World War I except for in the final weeks when their troops would defeat German troops in Alsace-Lorraine. During the treaty, U.S. President Wilson would negotiate for the creation of the League of Nations and countless small states in Europe. Yet the United States would not be able to join the League of Nations because of a failure in Wilson's peace plan. In the end, this would lead for the 20s and 30s to be a very relaxed time for U.S. interventionism, and Presidents Coolidge, Harding, and FDR to not intervene so much in the politics of Latin America or Europe. During the U.S. was taking a foreign policy break in the 20s and 30s, in Germany there was an expansionist government that was elected. This government was led by a certain Adolf Hitler. Japan began to pursue more expansionist policies, including its invasion of China in 1937, and for all they knew, they could invade the USSR or the South Pacific, which included the United States. This prompted the United States to remobilize to further its militaries, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would enact conscription and countless other measures to make the U.S. military stronger and more threatening to the rising threats of Japan and Germany. Germany would begin a massive war in Europe against Britain and France, and they would bring the British behemoth to its knees. During the Battle of Britain, Britain would not have survived without American aid. Also, Japan was fighting in the Pacific, and they were running out of oil. America had enacted an oil embargo on Japan after the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, And now Japan was running out of oil and they needed to attack the South Pacific colonies owned by the Europeans to gain more oil. This would lead to the Japanese attacking the European empires and the United States, effectively dragging the United States into war with Japan, and Germany would declare war on the United States 3 days later. This was called Pearl Harbor and happened on December 7th, 1941. The United States would be forced to fight off Japan and Germany both at the same time, yet victory would come. In 1945, Japan and Germany would both surrender. The United States would have to drop 2 atomic bombs on them. These bombs could level cities and had never been seen before. They were the most powerful thing ever. Harry Truman said that they were of biblical proportions. Yet the United States and the British Empire had to come with an unlikely ally to defeat Germany. This ally was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had driven Germany back to Berlin, and their armies had marched too far west into central Germany. The Soviets at the end of World War II had a sphere of influence that went straight into central Germany, effectively making them the new threat for Britain and the United States. This Soviet threat culminated in the Cold War. The Cold War was a time when the US and Britain were very wary of Soviet communism, and they were with reason. The Soviets were attempting to expand communism everywhere they could. The Americans and the British countered this with the Truman Doctrine led by US President Harry Truman. The Truman Doctrine was the exact opposite of the Monroe Doctrine. It prompted an interventionist United States. This interventionism is what led the United States' full economic capacity to cause it to become the hegemonic superpower that it is today. The United States and the Soviet Union met everywhere, from the Middle East to Korea to Vietnam. They almost fought massive wars in Europe, and both powers being nuclear armed almost caused the end of the world countless times, especially in Cuba in the early 60s. Yet this threat ended with President Reagan. Reagan would put the boot on the communist throat, and the Soviet Union would soon after collapse. This would lead to an American-dominated world. The 90s were the era where the current American superpower status was built. With the Soviet Union out of the picture, the only real threat to America was China. But China was just an impoverished backwater back then. The United States could literally do whatever it wanted. In this era, the United States being the symbol for correctness across the world was built, and countless interventions that broke international law were done by the United States with no one batting an eye. The 2000s had a very stark contrast to the 90s. The 90s had begun with the United States taking out the Soviet Union, its greatest rival. Well, the 2000s began with the Twin Towers falling due to some impoverished Islamic terrorists. This showed the weakness in the American superpower, and it broke the world's faith that it had in the all-powerful America. This also led to the U.S. intervening in the Middle East for countless wars, and they are still there after 17 years in Afghanistan. These wars have led to popular distrust of the U.S. government and people not necessarily liking the government. This has also led to the government being more intrusive upon the people and taking nearly tyrannical actions upon their own people by surveying them. This has all culminated in lots and lots and lots of distrust and unhappiness with the status quo. Another issue is that the Bush and Clinton administrations failed to keep American businesses in America, and they moved away to China. There they turned China into a modern-day superpower that could rival the United States. The Chinese economy today is growing quicker than the United States, and they are projected to pass the United States in GDP at some point in the 2020s. China may be the future, and they may end up beating out the American superpower, yet the United States still stands supreme due to its foreign relations. For lots of historical and cultural factors, the United States is the leading superpower in the world today. Part of the things that give them an edge over possible rivals, such as China and India, is that the United States has much better foreign relations than China or India. The United States has countless foreign relations with countless nations in every corner of the globe. China, for example, has shaky foreign relations outside of Asia. And even though China is fixing this with Africa, the United States is also fixing this. The United States has always had good relations with countless nations, and they will continue on doing this. The United States, for the time being, will be the leading superpower of the world. And right now, they still are the superpower of the world.